We're joined now by accountant, academic and activist who writes on finance, economics and politics, Khaya Sithole, to speak about this. A very good evening to you, Khaya. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us. Perhaps let's just start with the trade agreements that exist between the two countries and if they are the ones that dictate for this imbalance in exchange.
Yeah, so good evening and good evening to the viewers. And I think, so the key issue here is that trade between South Africa and Botswana can probably be categorized into three broad categories. There is what we first refer to as bilateral trade, which is essentially the trade between South Africa and Botswana. And then there's what we refer to as the regional trade, which is what we refer to as the South African Customs Union, which includes other countries within the region. And there's also, particularly since 2018, the entire Continental Trade Agreement, which obviously tries to facilitate greater trade relationships between countries in the continent. The key issue is that when we talk about the trade imbalance between Botswana and South Africa, we have to acknowledge that when we talk about bilateral trade, it's a question of volumes and variety. So when we talk about variety, we're simply asking the question of what are the type of goods that South Africa manufactures that are of interest to Botswana citizens. So of course, if you have many more things that you're producing as a country, then you've got a greater sense of variety. And at this stage, South Africa has got a much greater sense of variety of goods that it produces that it can actually export to Botswana than Botswana has. So that's the first problem. The second problem is what we refer to as a volume of trade. Now, you know that South Africa's population is estimated at around 60 million, while Botswana's population is much smaller at around 2.5 million. So, of course, even if you and I were simply saying that, Botswana and South Africa must exchange loaves of bread, the sheer size of the population in South Africa being 60 million versus Botswana's population size of much smaller simply means that the imbalance is always going to favor South Africa in the sense that the South African economic activity is going to be much larger than the Botswana economic activity. So the imbalance is really as a result of those two variables, which is the variety of what we are able to sell to Botswana compared to what they're able to sell to us, and also the sheer fact that we actually are a much bigger population. So of course, they've got much greater spending potential.
Perhaps let's just continue from that point, just looking at some of the commodities that Botswana exports to South Africa, including diamonds, beef, soda and ash, and what we export includes cereals, vehicles, beverages, etc. But my question is it also perhaps the overlap of the availability of resources between the two countries that also skews? I know you mentioned the population size and economic size as well, but is that a potential problem?
Yeah, so I think the reality here is that Africa as a continent does have a problem with logistics primarily. And when we talk about the problem of logistics, if it costs much more than it should for me to move goods from one location to another, from one country to another, that of course has a downside effect on the ability of citizens to afford those goods and services. So if, for example, we could be able to transport goods to Botswana at a price that is lower than a determined price, it would simply mean that many more people in Botswana are able to afford whatever it is that we're trying to sell to them. So South Africa at large still hasn't solved its logistics problem. That's the first problem. The second issue is that you mentioned, for example, that Botswana, one of their primary exports is diamonds. Now, we do know that Africa at large has got what we refer to as a beneficiation problem. In other words, countries like Botswana and South Africa do have natural endowments. They've got the minerals, whether it's gold, platinum, and diamonds themselves. But what we do very badly is that we take the raw material and then we send it offshore to other countries like Switzerland, for example, in the case of diamond, for them to refine it to a final product and for it to come back. Now, the consequence of that is that we're missing out on the economic windfall associated with us saying that, wait, hold on, let us not export the raw diamond. Let us actually refine it, turn it into a ring, whatever it is that you can turn it into, and then sell it to the international markets, which would mean that much more of the economic benefits and economic windfall will remain within Africa. So that remains a problem that all African countries have. And so far, what we've seen since 2018 in particular is that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is firstly trying to deal with the first primary problem of why it is so expensive for me to move goods from Johannesburg to Gaborone, for example. And of course, by the time it gets to the border, there's the question of the customs and all the tariffs and all those duties. So the initial model of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement was to say, let us us eliminate those barriers that actually make it difficult for us to trade with each other. And of course, once we lower those costs, it means that hopefully that we'll be able to trade a bit more. So of course, many more people will be able to afford a loaf of bread, for example, if that's what we're trading between ourselves. So that is the first mission. The second mission is to then say, how do we as African countries make it much more efficient for us to actually convert our raw materials into finished products and then sell them to the international markets, rather than the current model that says that we've got the raw materials, but we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the know-how on how to actually convert this into a diamond ring, for example. So let's send it somewhere and then it comes back for us as a finished good, which obviously makes it far more expensive. So those are the challenges that all African governments have been grappling with in the past few decades. And unfortunately, at this point, we still haven't found the absolute solution to that.
You mentioned earlier on the regional blocks and the kind of existing trade agreements in light of the AfCFTA. One of the things that the Minister of Trade and Industry of South Africa mentions was that we need to resolve challenges such as the rules of origin rules, particularly given the dynamics within the various regional blocks. How does South Africa and Botswana overcome some of these challenges?
It's a tricky one because, as I mentioned earlier on, firstly, we have what we refer to as a regional bloc, which is SACU, or the South African Customs Union, that involves South Africa, Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, and Namibia. So those countries have actually since 1910 been trying to say that when we trade with each other, we shouldn't actually have all these tariffs and all these duties at the border that make it so much more expensive for us to move goods from one country to the other. Because of course, if it's expensive, it simply means that Botswana may well be producing wonderful items, but if it's so expensive for South Africans to buy them, then they can't sell to South Africans, and then it becomes essentially an economic loss. So we've had the South African Customs Union for a very long time. It has its own challenges, and I think obviously the one thing that we probably have mastered in that is to say that let us not create additional price barriers. Let us not have additional tariffs that we can do away with. So that's what happens within that regional bloc of South African Customs Union. We've seen also throughout the African continent, there's other regional blocs. So ECOWAS, for example, will be dealing with the eastern part of the continent. So you'll see all these particular regions will say that let us not make trading with each other impossible. However, so the greatest challenge that always exists with intertrade, with trade between countries, is a question of, well, actually, if it turns out that we as Botswana are producing diamonds, diamonds are the type of goods that are actually acquired by people who can afford to pay a bit more. So why would you then sacrifice the ability to generate extra revenue through a tariff model? Because this is the type of good that once a person decides to buy a diamond, that's not a person who's struggling to buy things. So that tension point remains unresolved to say, well, should we then actually abolish tariffs in relation to this very lucrative product that we have as a country? And that's one thing that we still haven't resolved. But I think when you then look at what the African Continental Free Trade Agreement seeks to do, it seeks to say to all countries collectively, it is in our collective interest for us to be able to make trade between ourselves much easier. The problem, of course, is that I, as country A, may have particular goods and items that I think are my competitive advantage, that I feel that I can actually still sell them at a price that's much higher than what other people are willing to accept. So if you talk about diamonds, they're a lucrative luxury service. So of course, I know that I can push the needle a bit further. But once you look at that collectively, it then turns out that by us inflating the prices through tariffs, for example, it means that we're not trading enough with each other because of the income levels throughout the continent, for example. So then people in other parts of the world, which have much higher income levels, are then able to buy our goods, and then they then sell them back to us. So it really requires the collective acknowledgement that it's in our collective interest as a continent for us to be able to say that let us make trading easier between ourselves, and thereafter we'll see the long-term benefits. But every country has to manage its own budgets on an ongoing basis, and of course that creates new tensions that we aren't able to resolve.
Before we run out of time, so in terms of the tariff reduction schedules, and I'm thinking of it from the perspective of zoning, what do we still need to fix, particularly in terms of the AfCFTA?
So the original model of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement sort of had a three-step tariff reduction model. It was to say that the first 90% of tariffs relating to these goods and services must be abolished in the immediate term. And then thereafter, there was the 7%, and then there was the 3% eventually. And the idea behind that was to acknowledge that you couldn't really move to an overall abolition of tariffs overnight because some countries have become quite dependent on the revenues that they generate from those tariffs. So the idea was to say, let us actually identify categories of goods that we can say, look, collectively, if all of us agree that these goods can still be moved from one country to the other without us having to extract the tariff, we are collectively better. One country may feel that they're a bit squeezed, but collectively better. So that's how the model was created. And then in the medium term, it was then to say, let us move on to the 7% of the goods that is then say, in the medium term, we also need to abolish tariffs in that because at the end of the day, we believe that a free tariff regime is the way that we need to go to. And there's obviously always going to be some items that every country says, no, this is the only competitive advantage that we have, for example. So we do not believe that tariffs should be abolished completely. So that's how that model was actually created. So it's been happening since 2018, and we still actually have to do the research and the cogent analysis to say what have been the benefits of that. And of course, COVID-19 didn't happen because a lot of what we had thought was going to materialize between the period of 2018 up to 2023, which is the immediate 5-year period, would have been able to evaluate the impacts and the effectiveness of that. And of course, now we probably have to expand our analysis horizon to much longer than that in order to get a very clear picture of what has been the benefit of this.
Thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated. Accountant, academic, and activist who writes on finance, economics, and politics, Khaya Sithole.